Hi, everyone, and welcome to Adult Bible Studies. If this is your first time to try this study, we welcome you. And if you're a returned customer, we're glad that you're here with us. We're beginning a new unit today, and certainly it's an exciting time because we're in preparation for Easter. This Sunday is the first Sunday of Lent. And because of that, we're going to start a series of lessons. For the next 7 weeks, we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to be using Mark's account of the story of Jesus and of his ministry to guide us up to and into the Easter story. It's going to be a good study, and I hope you're going to be able to participate and be a part of this, and I hope that it's a blessing to you. Today we're going to, like I said, we're going to start in Mark. We're going to begin in the middle of Mark. Actually, it's pretty much the center of this gospel, chapter 8. And what we find is that Mark, the Gospel of Mark, can be divided into two halves. The first half is literally from the beginning of Mark up until this foundational passage for the lesson today in chapter 8, verse 27. In that first half, the emphasis is on Jesus and his early teaching ministry. His ministry is limited geographically, pretty much to Galilee, to that northern area of Palestine. And up until that point, he's taught, he's healed, he's ministered to the people, he's been the servant and the teacher. And as we get to this point in chapter 8, we're seeing a shift. The shift is that now Jesus is not performing his ministry there in Galilee as much as beginning to move physically toward Jerusalem and preparing for the things that will come. And that provides, like I said, the halfway point for this gospel. The Gospel of Mark was written by John Mark. John and his mother Mary were members of the early church. In Acts, we're told that the church in their area met in their home. He was a proselyte of Peter's, possibly led to faith in Christ by Peter. And he was kind of like a secretary or assistant to Peter. And so a lot of what Mark writes in his gospel are not only personal accounts that he's had, even though he was not an apostle, he was present at a lot of these events, but also they are sharing the things that Peter. It's like Peter is the co-author or the author, and Mark is the secretary writing that down and recording these things. So the Gospel of Mark is a powerful gospel in that sense that it carries personal testimony, personal witness, someone who has actually been there, seen it, heard Jesus, saw him perform his ministries, and hear him teach the things that he taught. Here's we start off in Mark chapter 8, verse 27. We find Jesus and his disciples went into the villages near Caesarea Philippi. Now, Caesarea Philippi is one of the most northernmost parts of Palestine. And Jesus and his disciples were there in that northern area of Galilee, and they were teaching. And a lot of things have taken place here. Jesus has healed. He's raised Jairus' daughter. He's healed the woman who had a bleeding problem. He's healed the blind. He has performed miraculous ministry of miracles and healing. And because of that, the disciples really have gotten caught up in the power of his ministry, the authority that he has, and the things that he is doing. And it's been a pretty easy ride for them in some ways because Jesus has been so popular. It's in this first half of Mark that Jesus feeds the 4,000 and then the 5,000, indicating the size of the crowds and the number of people and the popular response that he was getting. But here in this 8th chapter, as Jesus starts setting himself in preparation for going to Jerusalem, we see a change in that. And there's a real challenge in that change. We don't like change, do we? We like to have a sense of what's going on and what's going to happen, and we like to have a sense of how that's going to play out. And the disciples are no different than we're no different than the rest of us. Mark, in his gospel, has often said that he's kind of looks down on the disciples, or kind of discounts them a little bit because of their lack of insight. And yet, certainly at this point in his ministry, they had so many different ideas in their minds. We can get so many different ideas, can't we? A part of growing up is that we have uh, prejudices and understandings of the world and things that are fed into us as children. And sometimes as adults, we find that those ideas don't serve us well, and we don't agree with those fully. And that they challenge us and cause us to have to stop and reconsider things. And that's part of what happens here. Jesus and the disciples were there in that Caesarea Philippi, and he was teaching and ministering. It says, on the way, he asked his disciples. Jesus is really beginning to focus on his disciples and on helping them to understand. He knew that misunderstanding. He knew that lack of the depth of what it really meant for him to be there in his ministry, the goal of his ministry. And so he starts off with asking, who do the people say that I am? That's kind of a indirect way of doing it, and it kind of gets your disciples to thinking about, okay, who am I? Who am I to be? And our lesson title is that titles matter. Uh, what people called Jesus, how they saw him, how they interpreted his ministry, it was important. And Jesus says, so tell me, what do you hear the people saying about me? How do they interpret who I am and what I'm doing? The disciples say in verse 28, they told him, some say that you're John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. And certainly this is the point of reverence that the people had for someone conducting this type of ministry, itinerant ministry, going around sharing the good news of God and of his hope and love and grace, and sharing their faith with God. And so they did, for the people, represent John the Baptist, represent Elijah, represent the prophets. So that's a good beginning point. It's a good question. Jesus was a wonderful question asker, wasn't he? And he got the disciples to thinking about it. Okay, here's all these popular interpretations of who he is. And Jesus says, okay, then, what about you? Who do you say that I am? Oh, that's a little more up close and personal, isn't it? Who do I say that Christ is? And how do I interpret that? Peter, we're told, answered. In the Gospels, oftentimes it's one of the disciples who speaks, and most of the time that person is Peter, and most of the time he is kind of speaking what all of them are thinking, sharing together. And so Peter comes, just blurts it out, "You're the Christ," and Jesus says, "Wait, you got it right, Peter, but you don't have it completely right. You lack that understanding and lack that depth of what that really means." And so Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Some of the Bible scholars say maybe Jesus was trying to use reverse psychology here. Tell them not to tell, and then they will tell. I don't think Jesus plays that kind of game with us. I think he's pretty straight up and direct with us, and he's being that way with his disciples too. But nonetheless, he ordered them to be silent on that subject for right now. It's an important subject. He's raised the subject. He's brought that into their awareness and into their thinking processes, and it's going to be one of those questions that's in the back of their minds. Who is Jesus? Really, how do I interpret Jesus for other people? And yet they're not ready to answer that question in a sense of their own heartfelt understanding. It says, at that point, Jesus saw that it was a teaching moment. Jesus was not only a good question asker, but he was a good teacher, a wonderful teacher. And he saw that he had created a teaching moment. His disciples' interest was perked. They had thought a little bit about and tried to interpret some things, and they uh, he'd called them to hold on just a minute, think this through. I'm not sure that you're ready to go all the way with an exact, concrete kind of answer yet. So Jesus began to teach them, we're told in verse 31. He said to them, the human one is in our scripture passage from the lesson material, the Son of God, the uh, the Messiah, the whole human one, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, oh, chief priests, and legal experts, and be killed, and then after 3 days rise from the dead. Oh, no. Can you just imagine? That's like dropping a ton of bricks on these disciples. Everything had been going so good. Jesus was so popular. People were responding. They felt so good about who being associated with him and all these things. And now Jesus is saying the end purpose, the end goal of this is going to be what appears in worldly terms absolute defeat, standing against the religious authorities of the day and them being in opposition to him rather than joining with him, being put to death, and but then rising again. And they didn't understand this idea of rising again anyway. And so that just was something that just went right over their heads. But a lot of the other things were things that certainly they had hoped to be able to ride a wave into Jerusalem and find there that the religious leaders and people of that day would welcome Jesus and welcome his ministry and welcome his teachings. Uh, he said this plainly, we're told in verse 32. He didn't pull any punches. He just said it straight out. And sometimes when you're real direct like that, people get it. And sometimes it's like so much at one time that they close it off and can't receive it, isn't it? And that's a part of what happened here. It says Peter took hold of Jesus and scolded him. He brought Jesus off to the side and he says, Lord, surely you don't mean that. Well, Jesus did mean that. And Peter was speaking out of turn. He was speaking out of a lack of understanding. Jesus turned to him and he looked at his disciples, perhaps with his hand on Peter's shoulder, and he said, Peter, get you behind me, Satan. The Greek word for Satan means tempter. Peter, you're tempting me. You're encouraging me in the wrong way. Have you ever really been trying to encourage someone and realized that your encouragement was really leading them the wrong direction? It was being taken the wrong way. Jesus says, Peter, you've stopped being a disciple and you started trying to be someone who dictates to me my role, and you're out of place and you don't understand, you lack understanding, and because of that, you're tempting me and you're taking the role of Satan. Wow, what a rebuke. And yet, Peter is someone who can not only speak boldly, but who can hear these kinds of things. Uh, he was someone who could receive Jesus' correction. That's something that's a real gift in our day, isn't it? People are so vulnerable. It's hard to say anything other than, oh, you did great. It's kind of like the soccer mom syndrome where every kid gets a trophy, even if they just sat on the bench the whole season. We want everyone to feel good. And yet, sometimes it's not about feeling good. Sometimes it's about being challenged to work harder, to do better, to listen, to, in Peter's case, to open himself up to new perspectives of what the Messiah is and is to be. Jesus then says, after calling the crowd together with his disciples, Jesus said to them, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me and because of the good news will save them. It's a paradox, isn't it? Do you want to have life and have fullness of life? Then you've got to give up trying so hard to make it work. You got to give up being willing to do just anything for the purpose of success and power. It's not about success and power. It's not about worldly wealth and gain. It's about those things that really are most important. And sometimes we have to lay those other things at the altar and say, Lord, you have blessed me with these resources and I'm going to use these resources. But at the same time, I understand that they are not mine, they are yours. Getting our will aligned with God's will. And Jesus comes to those people who were following him. Do you reckon the crowd may have thinned out a little bit after he said that? I think it may have. I think some of those folks who were following him just to see a miracle or to receive a warm fuzzy in their hearts as they heard him speak about God's love and grace and the coming kingdom, some of those folks may have questioned and said, I don't know, this sounds like this guy's trying to set the hooks in me. You know, it's kind of like when you're hearing a sales pitch and the guy's been talking about how wonderful his product is, and then suddenly he says, and it's only so much, and you can do it in 95,000 equal payments of so and so and 0% interest and all these, and you say, oh, there it is, there's the hook. Jesus was not setting a hook. He was just being honest. You have one life, and you have to set priorities in that life, and you have to be willing to let some things go so that other things can be manifest and be the most important things. You can't do it all. You can't have it all. It can't be all. It's God's will. And God's will, when you trust him and allow him, you realize that it was the best thing after all. And it's because it has a lasting value. Jesus goes in and talks about that lasting value. He says, why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives? You spend all of your time being successful, all of your time doing things in the sense of winning other people's approval and gaining power and wealth, but you never learn how to use that effectively to serve God and to serve others. What will people give in exchange for their lives? It's kind of like the rich man who kept building bigger barns, and then he died. He had all these barns full of stuff, but what good was it to him? So likewise we can be when our lives are out of balance and our focus is on the wrong thing. And one of the things the season of Lent does is it calls us to question those things that are really important, to change our priorities, to look at our perspective on things and to see if we're getting off track, if we're really seeking God's will in all things. He goes on and he says, whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this unfaithful and sinful generation, the human one will be ashamed of that person when he comes to the Father's glory with the holy angels. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You need to make a decision. It's so wonderful to go to church and hear a heartwarming sermon. It's so wonderful to go to church and have brothers and sisters in Christ shaking your hand and smiling at you and welcoming you and bringing you into the community. And yet, none of that is the most important thing. The most important thing is having that relationship with God that allows you to have those other things, that allows you to receive God's grace, to be a part of God's people, to share with them and to receive from them. A give and take relationship, taking God's truth and love and grace as reality and as understanding that it is the absolutely most important. Making a decision and standing on that decision. We talked about last week the Great Commission, teaching them to obey all the things that I've commanded you. Obedience, relationship, allowing God to direct our lives for His will, and in His will is what matters. And in that will, we find life, not just life for today, but everlasting life, a life you can't lose, a life with God forever in eternity. Praise be to God. A good series of lessons as we look at Mark this quarter, and I hope you'll be able to join me often. And I thank you so much for your time, and I certainly feel privileged to share this time with you. God bless. Have a wonderful week.